So welcome to this webinar session where Drs. Lee and Ahtone will be presenting to us some of their work on the funding paths used by the US to fund land-grant universities, such as the University of Maryland. My name is Anaya Espíndola, my pronouns are she, ella, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology.
And I am Dr. Bailey J. Marquez, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of American Studies, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
And we are very happy to see that so many of you, and there's still more people coming in, have decided to join us for this event. The webinar has received financial support from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion of the University of Maryland, as well as the sponsoring of the Department of Entomology, the UMD Office of Multicultural Involvement and Community Advocacy. I have trouble with words sometimes. The UMD 1856 project, the Division of Student Affairs, the College of Computer, Mathematical, and Natural Sciences, the UMD chapter of the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, and the City of College Park. Before we start, we want to do a little short housekeeping overview so you can all know how to virtually participate in this event. First, you should be seeing a screen, your webinar on the screen at the bottom. The bottom part of your screen should look something like what is shown on this slide. And through this screen, you have the possibility of customizing this webinar to your needs and interests. And so this is a little overview of some of the things that you'll be able to do during this webinar and through this set of buttons. First of all, live transcriptions are being provided for this presentation, and so feel free to activate them by clicking on that little button that says CC at the bottom of the screen, and that's shown here with that blue arrow. You also have the possibility of interaction with other attendees and with the panelists, and so if you would like to share your reactions, your emotions, affirmations during the seminar, feel free to do that using the little bubble chat button that you can also find at the bottom of the screen and shown here with the red arrow. We are also going to be taking questions for the speakers throughout the seminar. And so if you want to submit your questions, please do so using that Q&A button that is also found at the bottom of your screen and is shown here with that orange arrow. Once you submit a questions, others can upvote that question if they would also like for it to be addressed. And to do that, you can just open that Q&A button, or, open that window and vote on the window that will open. Feel free to submit an upvote as soon as the questions comes to you. And also at the end of the talk, we will go over as many of these questions as time allows. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and that it will be later available on the YouTube channel of the UMD Office on Diversity and Inclusion YouTube channel. Finally, we want to make sure that you are aware that virtual environments can lead to harassment or intimidation of presenters and audience members. And for that, we want to make sure that all interactions in this webinar remain respectful. For this reason, we will not tolerate bigotry, hate speech, harassment, or derogatory language, either in the chat or the Q&A submissions. We will be observing these spaces throughout the webinar, and we will intervene if we see that it's necessary.
So prior to beginning the talk, we invite everyone to read and reflect on the university's land acknowledgement. So please take 1 minute to read and reflect. Thank you, everyone, for taking that moment. To introduce this talk, we want to really highlight this work because the topic of the webinar is so very important for UMD because of the physical space that is occupied by our university, as well as the material, human, and natural resources that have been commodified, used, and or destroyed to support the construction of the university. The land itself that UMD sits on is that of the Piscataway people, stolen and colonized, developed into plantations that enslaved thousands and profited from the labor and sale of human beings. The space where our university sits was funded through the dispossession and sale of indigenous lands across the continent. This space has also systematically gentrified and dispossessed local Black communities, like the local College Park community of Lakeland, and has been implicated in anti-Black violence and death and indigenous erasure in a variety of ways. We state these things at the outset of the talk, not to excuse them, to assuage guilt, or to ease our conscience. That is a rather empty performative gesture. Instead, we place the impetus on us as attendees at this talk to do more than acknowledge these truths about the place, history, and landscape of land grants institutions generally, and our university specifically. We must think about what this history means for political and social action, because acknowledgement alone is not enough. So in this context, we are delighted to introduce today's webinar and our speakers who have so graciously agreed to join us to present their work on the links between violent colonialism and higher education in the United States.
And our speakers today are Dr. Robert Lee, Assistant Professor of American History and Fellow of the Selwyn College at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Lee has a PhD in History from the University of California, Berkeley, an MA in American Studies from the University of Heidelberg, and an BA in History and Economics from Columbia University. Before joining the faculty at Cambridge, he was Junior Fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. His articles and digital scholarship examining the relationship between indigenous dispossession and U.S. state formation have received awards from the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, the Western History Association, the Society for History and the federal government, and others. He is currently writing a book on U.S. expansion into the Louisiana Purchase and stewarding a digital mapping project tracking the historical creation of real estate on the U.S. public domain. Mr. Tristan Ahtone, a member of the Kiowa tribe and editor-at-large of Grist, he previously served as editor-in-chief of the Texas Observer and Indigenous Affairs editor at How Country News. He has reported for Al Jazeera America, PBS NewsHour, National Native News, NPR, and National Geographic. Ahtone's stories have won multiple honors, including investigative awards from the Gannett Foundation and Public Radio News Directors Incorporated. He additionally led the High Country News team that received a George Polk Award, an IRE Award, a Sigma Award, a Society of News Design Award, and a National Magazine Award nomination. A past president of the Native American Journalists Association, Ahtone is a 2017 Nieman Fellow and a director of the McRock Foundation. And with that, let's welcome our speakers.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for allowing us to be here, especially Anahi, Allison, Bailey, Patrice. Thank you for all your hard work in bringing us in. We really appreciate it. So my partner Bobby and I are going to start from the beginning today and generally give you an overview of the story, land grab universities, as well as the practical use of the platforms that have been built around it. A reminder, if you like, we're using the hashtag LandGrabU to help aggregate stories, thoughts, and hot takes on the subject. So we encourage you to use it if you are sharing on social media. And we will talk here about the Morrill Act. So for those of you who are coming to this perhaps fresh or need a refresher, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act. which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation. And the story that we've learned around the Morrill Act is that land-grant universities were given the gift of free land to bring education to the masses. But as our investigation reveals, the Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. In all, the act redistributed nearly 10.8 million acres of land for more than 250 tribal nations for the benefit of 52 colleges. And combined, those 80,000 parcels of land that make up the Morrill Act's bounty represent an area approximately the size of Denmark. And our reporting provides a window into how universities profited from dispossession and genocide. But it also offers opportunities for additional reporting, research, and collaboration to further the investigative work that this project has kicked off. And we'll discuss that in more detail in a moment, but I'll first turn it over to Bobby to talk a little bit more about the Morrill Act and how this project came to be.
All right, can you hear me? I don't see me on mine. Okay, others see me. I hope. Well, let me just start by echoing Tristan's thanks really to Anahi, to Bailey, and Allison for organizing this. These events always take a ton of work going on in the background to go smoothly. So thank you so much for putting this together. And I see there are 200 participants now in the room. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a real privilege to be able to talk about our work on this project, Land Grab Universities. So what I'd like to do is start by giving you some background on the project and provide some additional detail on the Morrill Act of 1862, the law that's at the center of all this, and our approach to researching it. Now, the indigenous sources of university land has been an emerging issue in recent years. And this has come out of studies of slavery and the university that I'm sure many of you have seen. This was sort of a springboard to our research. These projects were going on at Brown University, at Georgetown, at Harvard. I'm sure there's activities going on related to it at Maryland. I don't know if it's crossed the Atlantic yet, but the University of Cambridge, where I work, just put out a major report on our ties here, the institution's ties to the transatlantic slave trade as well. And this way of thinking sort of moved into discussions of the indigenous history of North America sort of slowly in the last 10 years or so. In 2014, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, it flagged this issue of the Morrill Act and indigenous land. There have been cultural theorists like K. Wayne Yang who've discussed it from the perspective of decolonizing the university. More recently, there were important articles on this topic by Sharon Stein and Margaret Nash, who framed the Morrill Act of 1862 as settler colonial legislation that took from indigenous nations in order to expand agricultural and mechanical education for settlers. And what they started to do was sort of unpack the theory behind this. There had also been, before we started working on this, some efforts at places like UMass and Virginia Tech that had tried to map some of the Morrill Act footprint at their schools and to connect them to indigenous nations. But those projects hit some snags, and neither was complete. There had also been places, land-grant universities like Iowa, Michigan State, the University of Nebraska, that began mapping their Morrill Act parcels, but weren't looking at all or asking at all about who the land's original owners and caretakers were. Now, all of those early efforts really made three things, I think, clear when we started land grab universities. First of all, what they showed is that we now had the theoretical tools really to rethink and really add complexity to how we talked about the foundations of land-grant universities. And we were really primed to start using them. I don't think I've spoken to anybody really about this project who didn't immediately understand the issue at hand. It's like throwing on a light switch, right? Of course, the land and land-grant universities had to come from somewhere, and it's not particularly surprising that it came from indigenous dispossession, which was the fundamental act, really the fundamental act at the heart of North American colonization. Second of all, what this early work made clear was that we now had not just the theoretical tools, but the methodological tools to turn a general appreciation of this issue into a concrete body of actionable and empirical knowledge. And that these tools were primarily cartographic. They had to do with geospatial and digital mapping technologies. So if you could obtain historical data about the location of land-grant university parcels, you could start building a database that would use simple functions in digital spatial analysis to match specific land-grant university parcels to specific instances of indigenous dispossession. And using those same tools, you could visualize those complex connections in dynamic and static maps in really rich and telling ways. The third thing that was clear to us when we were starting this was that the time was right to undertake this project. The question of how land-grant universities were built with indigenous land had been mostly neglected in the scholarship and public memory of land-grant universities, and people were ready to start thinking about and really reckoning with this issue. So those three things, right? The theory, the method, the timing, set the backdrop for the land grab universities project. And this is where the High Country News collaboration got started. It was 2018, and Tristan and I, we were both on fellowships at Harvard University, which was really fortunate because as you heard in the introduction, he's a journalist and I'm a historian, and we don't normally run in the same circles. And the project that we developed was really a disciplinary hybrid that tried to combine historical research, spatial analysis, and investigative journalism, and to bundle them into a multimedia report that was designed to communicate our findings, to support ongoing research, and to draw attention to the living legacy of colonialism and genocide that is baked into the foundation of land-grant universities. So before I get more into our investigation, and can we move on to the next slide? I just want to give you a quick sketch of the Morrill Act itself. I'm going to focus on the side of the history of land-grant colleges that has traditionally received far less attention, right? And that is the colonial practice of doling out literal grants of land to generate income for higher education. Now, this project does not start with the Morrill Act of 1862. Its roots, as far as I can tell, in the Anglo-American world, go back to Ireland in the late 16th century during the Tudor conquest of Ireland by the English. And this is when Trinity College Dublin is founded in the 1580s, 1590s, using grants of expropriated Irish land. This practice very quickly then jumps the Atlantic in the early 17th century to Jamestown in Virginia. In Virginia in 1618, there's a college founded called Henrico College with a 10,000-acre land grant of Powhatan land that had been recently appropriated by the colonists. Now, Henrico College is never going to teach a class. It's going to get destroyed in an uprising in 1622. But this practice is going to live on in North America. Harvard starts getting land grants of Pequot land in Massachusetts in the early 1650s. And it's actually hard to find colonial era colleges in what later becomes the United States that didn't receive these types of grants in order to fund their operations. After the American Revolution, the US is going to adopt this colonial practice and expand it. There's a college, it's no longer in operation in Mississippi called Jefferson College. In 1803, it gets one of the earliest grants from the United States. It's Choctaw land. It's given to the college in order to underwrite its operations. The most famous graduate of Jefferson College, which is named for Thomas Jefferson, is another Jefferson, Jefferson Davis, who's going to become the president of the Confederacy. What happens next is the United States starts employing this practice through its activities creating new states in the West. It passes enabling acts that turn territories into states, and as part of those activities, it creates basically dowries out of expropriated indigenous land to launch various state universities, places like the University of Missouri, which was founded decades before the Morrill Act. Now, what happens in the 1850s, and this is typically where the histories of land-grant colleges start, is that you get the creation of land-grant universities like Michigan State University, Pennsylvania State University, that are founded with land grants, but also with the idea of practical agricultural and mechanical arts education for the masses. And this idea that is going to get nationalized in the 1860s through the Morrill Act, this ad hoc approach is going to get turned into a national system. The idea behind the Morrill Act of 1862 and the land-grant universities that are launched with that law was social uplift for the white majority in the emerging United States, for expanding education for the agricultural and industrial classes, providing practical knowledge that could be used to build and grow the economy. The push for this kind of education was coming out of places like the Northeast, like Ohio, like Illinois, Vermont, New York, where there were these agricultural societies that were popping up, trying to find ways to increase productivity. Justin Morrill, who's a congressman from Vermont, he gets behind an agricultural bill in the 1850s, an agricultural college bill in the 1850s. And it doesn't pass until 1862, when you have Republican control. The Congress solidified during the Civil War. You can see the full name of the act passed in 1862 here, and you can also see why people just started calling it the Morrill Act, right? I mean, this is a mouthful. An act donating public lands to the several states and territories, which may provide colleges for the benefit of agriculture and mechanical art. So the Morrill Act. So when the Morrill Act is passed, it wasn't passed in a vacuum, right? It's one of 3 landmark land laws that were all passed in 1862. That's the Homestead Act, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, and the Pacific Railroad Act, both of which gave up much more land than the Morrill Act, but using similar practices, taking indigenous land, giving it to either individuals or corporations, in order to subsidize the development of the United States. And what you see going on at universities is a similar practice. Now, even these 3 land laws of 1862, this sort of the big 3, they are headliners for thousands of land laws that are passed by the United States in the 19th century. And all of these laws involve the same basic core practice of redistributing land taken from indigenous nations through treaties, through seizures, and either selling it off to raise revenue for the United States or giving it away to various individuals, corporations, organizations, states, colleges, to promote economic development. Now, you might be wondering if Justin Morrill, who's pictured here, was aware of all of this, right? And the answer is yes. I mean, of course, right? He was very well educated. He was self-educated, and he knew perfectly well how the system worked. He didn't talk about something like colonial extraction, right? Which is a term that we might use today for what was going on through these laws. US politicians of this era, sort of national politicians like Morrill, they didn't seriously debate the ethics of redistributing indigenous land because there was widespread agreement in Congress that it was both desirable and inevitable. Now, what they did debate was what to do with all of these spoils of settler colonial conquest that were coming into the hands of the United States, all this land that the US was taking. And it's in those discussions, right, where you'll find people like Justin Morrill encouraging his colleagues to use the United States as, and this is a quote, the United States' Western Empire amassed through her triumphs over the savage to fund his agricultural college bill. Of course, that side of the Morrill Act history wasn't emphasized by historians for a very, very long time. The literature has focused on the results of the Morrill Act for the expanding middle class of the United States, not the origins, right? And it's couched these institutions as democracy's colleges. A lot of what you see in the literature, in the books, articles, there's a bunch of it written about the Morrill Act, is asking this question of, to what extent did the Morrill Act live up to its promise to democratize access to higher education in the United States? Not how did it fund this program? So let's talk a little bit about how the Morrill Act actually worked. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read all the points here. I'll go through them a little bit, but this is just a visual aid. What you see here is one of the graphics from land grab universities. All the graphics and static maps were made by Margaret Pierce, who's a cartographer on the project. And this one explains sort of step by step how the Morrill Act worked. So first, what happens is that Congress offers participation in this program to the states. They don't have to say yes, but they all do, because they're getting this bundle of land that they can then use to sell off to start colleges. Now, second point here, where does this land come from, right? Some of it had already been acquired from indigenous nations, sometimes few years before, sometimes decades before. Some of it would be acquired in the future after the Morrill Act was passed. What about point 3 here? How big were these grants? Now, they ranged in size from about 90,000 acres to 990,000 acres, nearly 1 million acres. The largest went to New York. And the size was determined based on the size of the congressional delegation of a state, which is itself a proxy for population. So more populous states will get larger grants. I think in the case of Maryland, their grant was like 210,000 acres, slightly on the larger side. I think most were around 150,000 acres, but they went all the way up to nearly 1 million, which is larger than the state of Rhode Island. Now, this fourth point here, I'll go into a little bit more in a minute. But there was a big difference in how these lands were parceled out, and it basically broke down to an east-west divide. Eastern states, like Maryland, got something called scrip. Scrip was like a coupon. Each one was for 160 acres that could be selected anywhere on the surveyed public domain of the United States. So when you fly over the United States today, and you see all those grids, all those gridded parcels out of the window in the Midwest and in the West. Those are the parcels. A 160 acre parcel like that could be selected anywhere in the public domain. Then there was the Western states, which still had lots of public land that had been taken from indigenous nations and not yet parceled out through land laws. The Western states had to choose land from within their border. So you see Montana up there with the land from within its border, and you see maybe Connecticut, New York. I can't see it well either, all over the place. Now, the fifth point here, how do you turn this grant into an endowment? Well, you have to sell it off. And what most Eastern scrip states are going to do is they're going to sell off the scrip in bulk to speculators to raise funds quickly. A lot of the Western states are going to hold on to it a little longer. They're going to send out these agents who are going to pick the parcels, try to find the best ones, and then try to sell them slowly for a profit. I went to the University of California, Berkeley. That's where I got my PhD. They ran a real estate office with this land for decades in the late 19th century, slowly selling it off in order to find the best price to increase their endowment. If we go to the next slide, we'll just get a zoomed in version of that east-west divide, the scrip versus land states. Here's the University of California, land selected from within California versus Cornell University, New York. Its scrip redeemed in a large number of states, I think 16 or 17. You can count them up here. But what you also see in this map, Margaret's maps that she made, and the sort of statistics in red on the side, is how this methodology using this GIS can really break down what's going on and get into sort of the details of how this worked, not just as a theoretical form of settler colonialism, but as a practical empirical program that really had an effect on people's lives and on these places where it was connected to. If we go to the next slide, we can see just how accurately you can map these parcels. This is Tucson, Arizona on the left, and this is a piece of land that you see in red here that was seized from the Apache in the 1880s. It's selected by the state of Arizona for the benefit of the University of Arizona. And on the right here, you can get down onto the ground here. Here's the Apache Tears Motel. This photograph and the others that you see in land grab universities were all taken by Kalen Goodluck, the photographer on the project, who was able to take the data, load it into his phone, put it into the GPS, and go out to these parcels and see what's there. So if we zoom back out on the next slide, what we can see is what the High Country News collaboration was all about. It was about finding all of these individual pieces and putting them together into a composite whole. The project's goal was to unspool the Morrill Act, not completely. We didn't just want to identify parcels that benefited a single university or were located in a single state, but we wanted to locate them all insofar as that was possible, and to track down the indigenous origins of each one of these parcels in order to gain a sense of the enormity of the wealth transfer that was happening. And wealth transfer is really the key term here. And this map that you're looking at is the result of the investigation, really in its most condensed form. By layering information about the Morrill Act parcels and land taken from indigenous nations, you can start pulling at the threads of this history, and you can start telling new stories, you can start gathering statistics to try to understand how it worked. So just to summarize quickly what you're seeing here and what Tristan said earlier, the Morrill Act gave away what amounted to 10.8 million acres to 47 states, which sold or leased the land and funneled the endowments to 52 universities. Most of these were public schools, some were private, and the land came from nearly 250 different tribes and nations whose land had been claimed by the US through 162 different treaties, ratified and unratified treaties, various land takings, seizures through executive orders and congressional acts. And when you look at how much was paid, when you look at how much the United States paid indigenous nations for this land, it's roughly $400,000 through these various broken treaties. And the same land, the same parcels, around the same time raised nearly $23 million for the university. So that's a ratio of about 57 to 1. For every $1 spent to acquire Indian title, as it was called in the 19th century, the university endowments are able to rake in $57 in principal. It's a measure of the power of the United States as an emerging colonial power in the 19th century. And here you see those 80,000 parcels spread out across 24 states. Now, in the case of Maryland, what you had was a 210,000 acre grant. And we were able to locate just under 203,000 of those acres, or about 97%. That was a bit low for us, actually. Typically, we were over 99%. I'm happy to talk about the reasons why it was slightly low, if anyone is interested in sort of nitty gritty. Maryland was very eager to raise funds quickly, like a lot of these scrip schools. So it put the scrip on the market and it sold it in blocks in 1867. It raised $112,000 in principal. And it actually wound up using about 10% of the proceeds to illegally pay down its debts. But the capital was restored by the state legislature a couple of years later in 1872. I'm not exactly sure how the proceeds were invested from there, but that is something that an industrious class or an industrious reporter at UMD could probably figure out. Now, this land, the Maryland land, is located in 29 indigenous land cessions made between 1808 and 1857. It's now in 9 US states. The largest cash came from Ottawa and Ojibwa land that was obtained by the US in 1836. That was about 46,000 of the acres. For title, the US paid 12,000 about for Maryland's case, and the endowment raised was about 112,000. So in this case, it was a multiple of about 1 to 9. Now, what you can do with this approach with the information that we've gathered is reconnect histories of dispossession to histories of land redistribution in order to move from the abstract understanding of universities as beneficiaries of conquest to the ability to tie specific institutions to specific tribal nations. Now I'm going to hand it back to Tristan, and he'll tell you a little bit more about the project's online tools.
So one of the things that we wanted to do with this project was make our data available to anybody who wanted to do additional reporting or research or to even fact check our findings. So if you're not comfortable with using spreadsheets, if you're not a heavy data user, we wanted to make sure that you could still have access to this information in a clear and user-friendly way. So on landgrabu.org, which you can see here, you have access to the same data that we did with the same level of accuracy. And you can explore all of it through interactive maps and web pages. So university pages like Maryland's here gives you a lot of information: founding date, student enrollment, how many acres it received. You can adjust for inflation with that little button up there. Jeff McGee and Cody Luff developed this site and the functions. And it really gives you a better grasp on just how much return is coming back to these institutions and where connections are. You'll see here on the interactive map that there's a lot of history that's sort of being packed in here. You can see the state boundaries, treaties, land cession boundaries. As you can see, you can toggle satellite maps. You can really fly through all of the different connections that you're seeing here, zoom down to the acre, and see where that land is in its specific history. You can locate yourself with the crosshairs, or you can put in an address. Here I'm putting in the address for Dollar General out in Michigan. You can see it's right next to a parcel, so you can really see whether or not you live on a parcel, whether you live next to a parcel, what's located there with the address checks. There's really a ton of information here to play with, and it allows you to explore and really construct your own narratives, do your own research, or report out different stories. So, and it's an invaluable tool that we keep using regularly, and I use fairly regularly in terms of my reporting. You'll see also in this case that University of Maryland did not respond to request for comment. This was typical response at the time, and it is important to remember when this story came out. Originally, when we started working on the story, we had partnered with about 24 local outlets and shared our data pretty early to produce local versions and regional versions of this story. So we have multiple trainings with reporters, talk through angles, really tried to work to make sure that there were people on the ground who could do some deeper digging. And the plan was to release about 20 or so stories around the country on the same day or week using the same data. But of course, COVID-19 sort of got in the way. Our story was locked into our print schedule in late January of 2020. And obviously shortly after COVID made landfall in the US, and 2 weeks before the story published online, lockdown started. So every single one of our original partners dropped their land grab stories because they had to cover COVID-19 in their respective regions and states and cities. we were actually pretty sure nobody would read the story since there was only one story being told in every outlet on the planet at that time. What I recall also is that on the day that we published, our story was the only story that wasn't COVID related in the collective Twitter feeds of High Country News staff. So that was really kind of a scary moment for us and what was going to happen with the story. And obviously, as we got closer to publication, universities were beginning to deal with COVID, and many were very straightforward with us about the pressures they were under in regards to our request for comment. I will argue, though, however, it has been 2.5 years since we asked for comment and still haven't heard anything back. And as I mentioned earlier, you can see here in the stats, you can see that in 2018, when we collected data that was available at the time, 42 students at the University of Maryland identified as American Indian or Alaska Native out of more than 41,000. So a little more on the maps here. Here's what you can do when you explore. So if you take a look at University of California, for instance, you can get the mile-high view and see all of the connections the university has to Morrill Act lands. If you zoom in on Los Angeles, you can get more detail on the individual land parcels, as you can see here. And right now, it just looks like kind of raw data on some level. But essentially what developers Cody and Jeff have done is create pages for each one of these land parcels. So more than 80,000 individual web pages are on this site so that you can get an incredible amount of information, acre by acre, state by state, and university by university. So when you zoom into a parcel in California, like this one here on the screen, you can click on the parcels page and go to the page. And right there, when you go to that page, you can see treaty cosigners, when it was acquired by the United States, and the gains that are associated with it. And again, just with this page, you can really start to construct a story about one very specific piece of land. And because, as Bobby mentioned, the site works on mobile, you can actually go there by locating yourself on your phone and going to that actual parcel, which is what our photographer, Kaylin Goodluck, was doing. So again, when you're looking here at all of the maps that I'm showing you, it looks like raw data, it looks like numbers, it just looks like web sort of like pages that you can get a lot of data from. But when you actually go there, this is how we know that this is a piece of land that I've just showed you is also the home to the Directors Guild of America. We know that going to parcels in Washington here, that the Fort Lawton Post Cemetery in Seattle, which was once Duwamish and Suquamish land, was ceded by treaty in 1855 for the benefit of Clemson University and South Carolina states. And despite negotiating this treaty with the federal government, the Duwamish are still unrecognized and continue to advocate for their rights guaranteed under federal law. And this land was sold for about $4. Those universities raised about $58 from its sale. Again, locating yourself, this is how we found this land in El Rosa, Minnesota, taken from the Dakota and sold by the University of Minnesota for nearly $1,000. You can see now it's a scrapyard. And this is really just a few of Kaylin's photos and what you can do should you decide that you want to go out and engage with the data in sort of the real world. In terms of our reporting, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And this summer, or the summer when this story came out, we reported that at least 16 land-grant universities, which are nearly a third of the schools in the system, still retain more than 500,000 acres of Morrill Act land that brought in at least $88.7 million in revenue combined in fiscal year 2019 alone. But it's also important that while that sounds like a small amount of money, it's important to keep in mind that we only collected financial data for fiscal year 19. So it's unclear how much total profit these lands have brought into the institution cumulatively over the last century. Currently, we are working on a follow-up story using those remaining lands as a jumping off point. What we're dubbing Land Grab 2 will likely be out next year. And our primary goal now is to track how much land universities currently own and how universities use that land with a specific focus on resource extraction. Because what we discovered in the course of our original reporting is that many institutions engage in oil and gas or timber harvesting to support their operations. And what you're looking at here with these very rudimentary kind of maps is Washington State University lands. It's a lot of colorful blobs at the moment, but it is telling us a story. The purple outlined squares that you're seeing are Morrill Act parcels. And the lavender blobs that you can kind of see under them are ag school lands that support the university. So in 2020, we know that Washington State University made more than $6 million from timber sales alone. That became dimensional lumber for construction, pulp for paper mills, specialty cedar for shingles and utility poles, all harvested from these lands that you're looking at here. We also know that since 2003, these lands have produced approximately $330 million for the university to construct buildings and to fund the school's retirement. So this is raising questions for us really about a just climate future and if it can be balanced with low-cost education provided by land grants. So what do we trade by supplying the next generation with education that's built on dispossession and supported by trading on the planet's very survival? This is how we're really thinking about tying indigenous dispossession in the 1860s to the climate crisis that's happening right now. And we spent nearly a year filing multiple public records requests to get this information. We're close to getting those fully complete so we can really start crunching that data and doing some more spatial analysis nationwide. And that data, of course, will be made public and accessible through our GitHub page when it's up, where the original data still lives. And I'll let Bobby talk about that briefly.
Yeah, I do want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to go through this quickly, but I do want to introduce you to all of the open source material that we have put out for this project. So the Land Grab Universities project has sort of 3 levels of curation in the materials that we produce. First, there's the magazine article, which really guides readers through the findings. Then there's the landgrabu.org website that Tristan was running through earlier, where users can explore the data for themselves, looking at places, nations, schools that are important to them. But finally, there is the public data that we put out, all the material that we collected, the geospatial data sets, bibliographies. There's a ton of material here that you can use, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can build off of what we have done to take this in new and interesting directions. This is just the GitHub page here. If we go to the next one, we'll see that there's a user guide, which puts all of the fields of the data in plain English. And this is what it looks like here when you pull it up on your desktop. I mean, some of the material is geospatial data, so you have to have some technical skills to be able to map it, although the barriers are always decreasing, but most of it is just in Excel, right? It's a spreadsheet. You can open it up on virtually any machine and go through it. There are just, it's just a very big spreadsheet with about 80,000 rows of data. But what can you do with this material? Just to give you one quick example here, this is something Texas A&M did with the data over the summer. It's at their Forsyth Museum, the university's art museum. This is a map that they made with and an exhibit script that they put together with some of the data from landgrabu.org. It was called Here, Faces and Voices of Native Aggies, and it's about the history of indigenous students at Texas A&M. It ran in the art gallery this past summer. And what they did here was they took the database and they identified tribal nations whose land went to Texas A&M. And they mixed that with a custom map that they made of indigenous territories and drew these sort of connector lines similar to the ones that we have on landgrabu.org. And they pulled in relevant statistics that they generated out of the data set in order to educate visitors to their museum about this aspect of the history of land grant universities. I don't think there has ever been a piece of an exhibition like this at a land grant university before. So I was really excited to see it. It's something simple that a student group could put together to put up to educate the student body about the history of the university. But let me give it back to Tristan, and he'll tell you a little bit about how others have used and reported on the piece.
Yeah, I mean, land grab universities really started a public conversation on the debts that universities owe to indigenous communities that has continued for the last 2 years, and we believe will continue long into the future. And there are a number of ways in which we've seen researchers and reporters engage in the work, and each is really unique to the institution and community. And I know that we're coming up on time, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions. But in terms of reporting, we've seen a lot of localizing, contextualizing, and adapting data. And of course, at universities, we've seen everything from moves to free tuition for Native students, all the way to demands for investigations, creation of projects to map universities' financial windfall. These are obviously just a handful of some of the moves that we've seen since publication. But generally, this is sort of an overview of the land grab project, and want to make sure that we can chat with you all a little bit more before time is up. So we'll close it for the time being for questions.
Well, thank you all so much for that incredible talk. I just personally want to say, as someone who teaches Intro to Native Studies, I love introducing students to this tool and this website. I do so every semester I teach, so I really appreciate you all coming and presenting on the work you've done for this. It's a great tool for educators and for those of us that are trying to introduce students to this. So thank you so much. So we have a variety of questions that have popped up in the Q&A, many of which you all have been addressing throughout your talk. I think I'll sort of combine a few so we can get to as many as possible. There's a few questions on here that are getting at sort of what are the goals of tying land grant universities to these specific parcels. There was a suggestion that possibly universities could provide reparations for specific tribes, possibly in the form of free college education. But I guess what could be some other material goals or ways of using this data that you envision through being able to have this sort of material data that connects universities to specific sites of land and specific tribes and specific numbers?
I mean, I guess I could start briefly is that, I mean, in terms of the original reporting around this, it's, the idea was obviously just to sort of illuminate what the knot, as Dr. Lee has sort of talked about, unspooling that. But I mean, I think in terms of use or where things can go, I think, I mean, to some degree, I'd say I'm quite limited in terms of thinking about where this can go. I think some obvious, the lowest hanging fruit might be like reparations in the form of tuition, but I'm much more interested in ideas of land returns and land back. However, that's also to say that in making sure that this is open source for folks, we really hope that that's where a lot of that creative thinking and comes in, is that land grants seem like a good place for people to start really sort of critically engaging with the data and applying ideas that just we never thought about. I mean, we've seen the ways in which people have engaged with this that have just never even thought about where some of the stuff has gone. And I think that's really the most exciting thing about making sure that it's open. But those are the bargain basement level for me. Is probably tuition's great. I'm not sure that's reparations. I think that's settling a debt. Reparations is returning land that's stolen.
Yeah, I'd just add, I mean, there's a spectrum. This question always comes up. I mean, you saw one example in the creation of that exhibit piece at Texas A&M. Some of it has to do with educational initiatives, curriculum redesign, cluster hires. the development of programs or the transformation of Indigenous studies programs into departments. I mean, the most basic thing, and I think the thing that we sort of framed part of the original article around was what we had at the beginning of this talk here, the land acknowledgement, right? This is material that can be used to enrich and provide a more accurate land acknowledgement for land grant universities, because it can point out that these universities aren't just built on Indigenous land, they're built with capital generated from distant Indigenous lands. And that is part of the story of land grant universities as well. So at a basic level, it's sort of acknowledging this history and finding ways to bring it into the discussion happening at land grant universities so that they can, I mean, from my perspective as a historian, so that they can better understand and have a fuller grasp of how the world that we live in now came about, right? And then there are all the policy possibilities. Tristan was talking about some of these related to scholarship programs, tuition remission. Some of that is already going on. And it can go all the way back to land return and thinking about creative ways to do that.
And then getting at that also, there was a quick clarification question asking you all to explain why states like Maryland were gifted parcels that were so far away. What is it about Maryland, for example, that got parcels so far?
Yeah, this had to do with the structure of the act and the point in time when it happened, you know, in the 1860s. All of you in Maryland, I'm sure know, and you know, Maryland is colonized originally in the 17th century. By the time you get to the 1860s, the land within Maryland has been redistributed, privatized in various ways, parceled out to the state in various ways. There is no more land or no desirable land for the University of Maryland to take up within the state that is in federal hands, right? The Maryland is not part of the federal domain of the United States. The federal government is not involved with the redistribution, the point of redistribution of that land. So what it does for Maryland and all the other eastern states is it provides these sort of coupons, which can be anywhere on the public domain of the United States, which is 30 states. It's 30 Western states. So all of Maryland's land is going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of miles away. And they are not going to select it directly. The way that this all works is it's sort of a layered process that can allow sort of middlemen to extract capital from it. And the way that the University of Maryland gets capital is by getting these coupons gratis and then being able to sell them on secondary markets to speculators who are then going to further churn the emerging land markets of the United States. And they can extract value in that way from these very distant lands.
So we'll end in the last 2 minutes with a method question, which I'm sure is your favorite. But there was a question around choosing particularly what methodologies you used for the project, and if you used any Indigenous sources or Indigenous research methodologies alongside some of the other methods you used, the historical and archival methods and mapping methods, and maybe what your thinking was for the types of sources you used.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges we had was trying to identify Indigenous territories. And there are multiple ways to do that. Some have to do with consulting communities and asking where was their historical territory. Others have to do with identifying where the United States said, or who the United States said it acquired the land from. And we eventually, we had long discussions about this, and eventually went with the second method, selecting the land that the United States said it got who the United States said it acquired the land from, in order to understand this as a program instituted by the United States in which Indigenous nations were excluded from the process.
Thank you all so much. We have oh, Tristan, would you like to add to that at all? Or?
I was going to say in terms of sort of method there too. I mean, really, one of the things in terms of making sure it's open source, I think really comes from that sort of idea of like sharing and making sure that like we are being accountable to readers and making sure that other like readers can be a part of this too. Is that well, you know, when it comes to memory and history, what we can do here is provide, you know, the actual receipts, the actual sort of information that you can go with from here. But in order to sort of make that information stronger and have more depth, that really requires everybody to be involved. And I think that's really where that sort of more indigenous methodology really comes from, is making sure that that's easily accessible to everybody for as much as possible. So yeah. And I just would say, because there's that conversation going on there about where reparations should come from, just to be very clear, it's not just land grant universities, it's all of the United States. So this is just one focused area. This methodology, I think that Dr. Lee has really come up with and has led this investigation and leading the next one, can be applied to almost anything in the United States. So.
Yeah, well, thank you both so much. Are there any last words either of you would want to leave us with, since we are at time for our webinar today?
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who came and stuck it out to the end. That's great. It's great to be able to share this material.
Thank you both so much. And thank you to all of the attendees. Please look for the recording of this webinar on the Office of Diversity and Inclusion's YouTube channel. Thank you all so much.